Now, as a few more people drift in on an eventful Monday, beautiful fall Monday in Washington, D.C. I'm Reed Kramer of the New America Foundation, and I want to welcome you here today for our session on behalf of our Next Social Contract Initiative and our Economic Growth Program. We've set up a real interesting session today featuring James Galbraith, Jamie Galbraith DeFriends, and his new book called The Predator State: How Conservatives Have Abandoned the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. Politics and Prose bookstore has joined us, and you're encouraged to leave here with copies. And we're also being joined by our virtual community. The event's being streamed on the WashingtonNote.com website, and I think pretty soon will be up on the New America website as well for any friends that have missed the gathering in real time. But we are pleased to be here today. Jamie's book is a significant book, real important, clear, well-written, strong arguments, and it's an especially timely book in ways that I think would excite the author and the author's publisher. Maybe as the market goes down, book sales might be going up. The idea for today was really to generate a real discussion, and perhaps it might turn into a eulogy for the free market, which looks to be either very sick or already dead. Either way, it's an important concept that has driven a lot of our political discourse, if not our national policies. And it's important and instructive to consider its past, its present, and even its cloudy future. Clearly, the role of government is set for dramatic expansion. Jamie anticipates a lot of this in his book, and he begins to outline what some of the characteristics of that expanded government could entail. He's also weighing in on the events of the day. In your packets is a recent op-ed that he wrote for the Washington Post that identifies some of the issues that we're facing in the context of the bailout and rescue plan, but also things that government is going to need to do going forward. And these ideas include setting up a national infrastructure bank, thinking about ways of now revenue sharing with state and local governments to forestall a crisis in services at the local level, and even looking at new government institutions to address the foreclosure crisis so that these events don't destabilize the economy and communities across the country. The piece ended, I thought, very provocatively with thinking about what we want the next economic recovery to look like, and he pointed to some of the biggest issues of the day that we should be addressing, namely climate change and energy sources. So big ideas for an important time. So I'm very excited to have Jamie with us today for a number of reasons. Since the publication of his book, he's been particularly in demand. He's a very provocative thinker, and he's a writer that writes for academic audiences in the economics world, but also is very interested in getting the discussion out into other more popular media outlets. So he's been able to kind of translate some of the debates that the economists are having into some real world relevance. So his insights into politics and history and economics have been very compelling, and I think are relevant to a lot of the central questions that are facing policymakers today. Also, I want to say that as a former student of Jamie's at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at University of Texas at Austin, I'm very proud to have him here at the podium. He had shaped a lot of my thinking on a number of matters, but importantly, it was how to address very complex policy problems that I felt his teaching was particularly valuable to me. I want to mention a couple of other affiliations that he has. He has a chair at the LBJ School. He teaches there and in the government department at the University of Texas, and also is affiliated with the Levi Economics Institute at Bard College, and with the organization Economists for Peace and Security, and he's a contributing writer for Mother Jones magazine. So we're going to have Jamie lay out the central arguments of his book, and then hear from two commentators who I think their insights will be particularly appreciated today. On my far right is Barry Lynn, who is a senior fellow here at the New America Foundation and a real leading force in our economic growth program. He's author of the excellent book called The End of the Line, The Rise and Coming Fall of the Global Corporation. This was written in 2005, so the fall of the global corporation that we're observing is something that Barry weighed in on a couple of years ago, and I guess it's not really a Dow 36,000 moment. Anyway, he's finishing another well-timed book looking at markets and government that I think will be out early next year. Mark Schmidt, recently a fellow here at the New America Foundation, but took over the executive editorship of the American Prospect a couple months ago. That's a very influential and important magazine and website where Mark shares his commentary on politics and policy. I think the second issue is on the newsstand now, but I would encourage everybody to subscribe, and it's really an excellent publication. He previously worked at the Open Society Institute and as a top advisor for Senator Bill Bradley. And I guess also I wanted to note about Mark, his essay on the next social contracts also included in your packets that he wrote while he was here. And it's a very relevant piece still about looking at some of the principles, the organizing principles for thinking about government's role in the economy today as we watch government expand. So that's the lineup, and we'll hear from Jamie and the commentators. Jamie can respond, and then we'll be able to open it up for some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Reed, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. 33 years ago, I was just beginning my first real job on the staff of the Banking Committee in the House of Representatives, when one day my boss, the chairman, Congressman Henry Royce, came out past my desk and said, "You have to come with me. We need to go to a meeting." And we walked over to a room, I think in the top floor of the Cannon Building, where the New York City congressional delegation had gathered, and all the great figures of that age, Bella Abzug and Liz Holtzman, and a young man by the name of Charlie Rangel and Steve Solars and the others were there to beg for Henry Royce's help in the great financial crisis that was overtaking New York City at that moment. And Royce listened to them for a few minutes, and he said something which is burned into my brain. He said, "Don't worry, my staff will have a plan for you in the morning." That to some degree is, in fact, the story of my life. I now find that having lived through and worked on a sequence of financial crises that we now face, the very largest and most profound one, certainly of my career and probably of the career of any economist still living today. And it's a confluence then of the crisis in the book that I want to talk about, because the book, to some degree, reflects an analysis which helps to explain the crisis and helps to understand what has to be done about it. And I want to say that the book begins in a spirit of respect for ideological and policy opponents that I faced very unsuccessfully almost 30 years ago in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the first years of what became to be known as the Reagan Revolution. That policy movement was based upon a foundation of ideas. ideas that included the idea of monetarism, that inflation fighting could and should be handed off essentially exclusively to the Federal Reserve and exercised by control of the money supply. The idea that low tax rates, and particularly low marginal tax rates, would foster saving and therefore investment, causing the economy to move to a higher growth path. The idea that free trade and deregulation would generate a more efficient economic structure, improving the way in which we used resources. And the idea that balanced budgets, privatization, would shrink the size of government and move the economy again toward a higher standard of living by replacing the government with the market. These are ideas which I thought at the time were radical, and I thought they were wrong. But they were coherent. They represented a vision that was backed by academic authority and believed in good faith by people who saw themselves as policy intellectuals and who, in my view, deserved to be treated as such, because that's in fact what they were. That is to say, there was a public purpose and a coherent philosophy behind this movement. One has to therefore ask what remains of it today. And my answer to that is, apart from slogans, essentially nothing. The substantial content has, in practice, not necessarily in the ideas of everybody out there in academic life, but in practice, essentially disappeared from the conservative tendency in modern American government. Monetarism was an early victim in part of its own success. The end of inflation brought a dissolution of the relationship between money supply and the inflation rate, and the Federal Reserve drifted through various semi-coherent ideas about natural rates of unemployment, which came to an end in the late 1990s when we discovered that we could in fact have full employment without inflation, to a more recent preoccupation with targeting non-existent inflation rates. But since August of 2007, no one has spoken about that anymore, because preoccupations of a far more serious type have come to the fore. Tax cuts did not give us additional saving. It certainly didn't give us new investment. They did give us the plutocracy of overpaid chief executive officers who were dissociated from the welfare of the corporations that they were supposed to be running, and who were deeply prone to a competitive race to see who could be the best paid of them all at the expense of the long-term viability of those companies. And we saw that in Enron and in any number of episodes of corporate fraud, misfeasance, and abuse over the past 15 or 20 years. Free trade became a cover for favors for friends. It was not an accident that political administrations put their campaign directors in charge of trade negotiations, and that their primary objective was, for example, to do things like extending patent protection for pharmaceutical companies that had really nothing to do with the larger conservative vision of free trade. Also, grave unanticipated implications of these agreements came to be felt in agriculture, where poor people were displaced from marginal lands in developing countries, and where many of them have migrated to the north, to the United States. And so one has to recognize an association which no one at the time these treaties were being debated was really discussing between the immigration issues that we have now and the trade agreements that we signed some time ago. Balanced budgets disappeared early, and except when they returned as an artifact of the information technology boom and bubble, they were never heard from again. And I assure you, they will not be heard from in any serious way for quite a few years to come, the way things are going. What we call conservatism in power today is a very different thing. It's transparently a form of big government cronyism that I call the predator state. In every corner, in particular, of the regulatory and procurement structure, the principle has been essentially similar. That is to say, to put clients and friends and supporters in charge, to let the lobbies rewrite the regulations and dismantle their enforcement. In effect, not to put too fine a point on the matter, this is a form of looting elevated to public policy on a grand scale. And that is the system under which we have been living for the last, better part of the last decade. It's a system which has large elements of of corruption of one form or another, but it's also important to understand why it is insidious to the proper functioning of an economy, even of a market economy, why it doesn't work in principle. There's a very, I think, general reason for this, which is that markets rely on trust. And in a modern society, any economic activity which extends is more complicated than the, let's say, the purchase and sale of a book, or let's say of a used book, is a matter of, requires an element of trust by the buyer in the integrity of the process that brings the product to market. That is true in a prosaic case of food and water. You do not buy or eat green vegetables raw if you do not think that the food chain is going to protect you from Salmonella and E-Coli. You do not wash them in your kitchen sink if you do not think that the regulatory process has given you effective tap water. And if you've ever lived in a country like China, where a country which is indeed prosperous and where real wages have been rising very sharply, and the cities are quite pleasant places, you discover that all kinds of protections are built in at the level of the household that we can dispense with in this country because we trust the regulatory system to make these processes work for us. We do not buy electrical appliances if you do not think that they are protected from catching fire in the middle of the night, and one can go down the list. These are very important elementary aspects of the way the regulatory process is essential to the functioning of a market economy. And it is just as true in the area of finance, except that in the area of finance, it is possible to get away with deregulating, with desupervising the financial system without the damage being immediately apparent and without the breakdown in trust happening in a very rapid way. It's impossible. It's possible, in fact, for the damage to accumulate as it has done over a period of years, and only then breaking out in such a way as to show the essential destruction, the rotting from within of the system. That is substantially what has happened. What happened in the middle part of the last decade was that very clear signals were sent by the financial regulators, some of whom showed up to press conferences with copies of the Federal Register and chainsaws. What kind of message were they sending? What did they have in mind? They were sending a very clear signal that anything goes in the financial sector, that any contract could be signed, that nothing would be supervised, that what could be gotten away with should be attempted. And as a result of that, a great many people were peddled mortgages on the basis of income statements that did not exist, on the basis of credit histories that did not exist, on the basis of appraisals that were inflated, and where all the incentive structures were to inflate the appraisals. And these mortgages, and with payments that basically were the maximum that they could sustain, with full knowledge that those payments would increase dramatically in 2 or 3 years. And the margin of safety was completely eliminated in this system. The mortgages were then bundled and sold downstream to investors on the preposterous theory that if you took 10,000 mortgages equally of the same type, that you would somehow average out the risks. That's the way it was, and that's what happened, and that's the system that we now have. The problem that we now have is largely the result of the fact that these mortgages have indeed gone sour, and the realization is that they have suffered an extreme loss in their nominal value, which affects the capital valuation of every financial firm that holds them, of every pension fund that holds them, of every investor who holds them, every private citizen who holds them. That's the essence of the crisis that we're in. It's a crisis which has a dimension in the real economy, that is to say, an enormous surplus of houses sitting in foreclosure with many more to come, which will act as a drag on property prices for years, and a dimension in the financial sector which is this enormous scrambling of assets, reduction of asset values, and elimination of trust, beginning in August of 2007 when the banks decided that they couldn't trust each other enough to engage in overnight lending, and culminating a few days ago in the rush to legislate something before Congress had to go home to get from now until we get to a new administration. Let me turn and spend a few minutes on the question of how we deal with this and where we go from here, a topic that I've been preoccupied with the help of a great many specialists and senior regulators and others with real experience in this area for the last 3 weeks or so, to try and frame not only an approach, a sensible approach to the current crisis, but also to begin to form ideas about what will have to happen in January when a new administration and a new Congress take office. There is, first of all, a problem of liquidity and trust. And that problem has 3 dimensions, one of which is the banking system, and that is to say a requirement that is, say, a problem of depositors in the banking system who need to be assured that their funds are not at risk. And that's a problem which extends well beyond the small depositors who have been taken care of by the FDIC to large depositors who need to be companies with payroll and so forth, who need to be assured that they can leave their money in their banks and not run the risk of losing it because other depositors lose their nerve. That is why it is essential that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation basically has the authority to do this, extend deposit insurance in effect to everybody who has deposits in the banking system. Secondly, a step that was already taken, the Exchange Stabilization Fund was put behind the money market funds to reduce the risk of a run on those funds and a complete freeze-up of the corporate paper market. Thirdly, the interbank borrowing problem, which is already, I think, in process of being resolved, in part because the bill that was just enacted permits the Federal Reserve to pay interest on reserves, an issue that we were already debating in the 1970s. But under very different circumstances, certainly now time to do this, and to basically make it possible for the Federal Reserve to lend directly to banks and to eliminate the need for them to assess their creditworthiness of their counterparties. In other words, to eliminate the need for interbank borrowing by making it possible for the Federal Reserve to take that function. I think that is now going to happen in the days ahead. So that's the liquidity problem. The solvency problem of the banking institutions is going to have to be dealt with. It will in part be mitigated to some degree by the bill that was just passed, but it will be mitigated in an extremely inefficient way with help going to a lot of institutions that probably shouldn't be helped, and some that should be helped probably won't get it. There is authority and will be a need for the federal government to take capital position in the banking system. That will come in due course. Then let's go on and look at what has to be done in the real economy. In the first place, there is the housing disaster. That is at the core of the problem, and stabilizing the housing sector is not a short-term proposition. In Texas in the 1980s, when nothing was done, it took 7 years to dig out from a much smaller regional problem, and then we had the help of a strong national recovery. So you're looking, if time frame is nothing is done, at least a decade. You could reduce that, I think, to 3 years with a very vigorous home loan corporation modeled on the homeowners loan corporation of the Depression era, which would have the authority and the funds and the incentive to renegotiate mortgages, convert them to rentals where necessary, and otherwise take steps to keep as many people as possible in their homes. That's necessary to stabilize the flow of payments through the system and to stabilize the neighborhoods, which will otherwise continue to deteriorate and continue to lose value, not only for people who took out subprime and alt-A mortgages, but for prime mortgage borrowers whose homes are simply affected by the declining value of their neighbors' homes. Secondly, it's a fact that in this country, state and local governments, especially local governments, are heavily dependent upon property taxes, and their tax bases are cratering, producing financial crises that are crises of their ability to borrow, crises of their ability to raise tax revenue to fund basic public services, crises of their ability to fund infrastructure on any medium or long-term basis. All of those issues need to be dealt with very early on in the next administration. I particularly recommend bringing back a favorite in my family, Richard Nixon, to give us a new version of a revenue sharing program whose purpose would be to preserve public services at the state and local level and preserve the jobs that those services provide, both because there is no rational reason in a declining economy to cut those services and because the effect of doing so is going to worsen and complicate the housing and foreclosure problem. Thirdly, there has been a major hit, no doubt about it, to the incomes of innocent parties, particularly elderly and near elderly, whose portfolios have been badly and will continue to be badly depleted by the collapsing asset values. And something needs to be done or should be done to preserve effective demand in that segment of the population. Any number of things could be done. You could simply do a supplement to the Social Security benefit, or that would be kind of a rough justice with a disproportionate effect on the lower end of the scale, or you could do something that would, you could direct the Treasury to buy back assets, particularly from pension funds, and to try and make, to some degree, some of those funds reduce the losses. You couldn't possibly make them whole. But anyway, that's a third step that should be aimed both at protecting innocent bystanders, but also at stabilizing a major flow of effective demand in the economy. Fourthly, one needs to think about going forward what the next expansion should look like and how it should be achieved. And I think it's fair to say that we have come to the end of a 15 or 20-year period when credit bubbles were driving the economy. First in the internet boom, and now later in the housing boom, and then briefly and very unproductively in a commodities boom, an oil and commodities boom last summer. This is not going to happen again anytime soon. The financial structure is too impaired to produce it, and even if it could produce it, we should have regulatory mechanisms in place to prevent another boom and another bust. But the fact is, the collateral isn't there. The houses are not worth what they were worth, and they will not support either mortgages or home equity loans on the same scale going forward. So it is going to come back to public purpose. It is going to come back to public responsibility to deal with setting a direction for the economy going forward. And I suggest that that is both a crisis and an opportunity. It is an opportunity to face the big challenge that faces the country, which is energy and climate change. A challenge which deeply involves three things: the way we use energy, the infrastructure which conditions how we use energy, and the way we produce it, the power grids and the production systems, all of which will need to be redesigned and rebuilt over a 30 or 40-year horizon so that the next generation does not face the kinds of environmental disasters which are clearly on the horizon at some point or another if we fail to act on this. So that is where you go, it seems to me, in the medium term, and that again is a public-private endeavor. It's an endeavor where the public sector sets the direction and builds the infrastructure and creates the facilities which make it possible for the private sector to do a great deal of the work, particularly in technology development and so forth. Okay. I wrap up the book, and then I'll wrap up this talk very, very quickly, by laying out three conceptual areas that need development in order to make a program like this work. The first one is planning. It's simply necessary for the government to have an independent capacity to think, independent of the market, because the interests of those who will be around in 30 or 40 years are not represented in any market. They have no voice, they have no effective demand. There needs to be, in other words, a capacity to imagine in a serious way what the future is like and to represent the interests that emerge from that act of imagination in the policymaking process. We have neglected that function of government over the past 30 years, and the result is we do not have the institutional capacity to meet those challenges. We need to rebuild that capacity. Secondly, there needs to be, I think, a rethinking and understanding of the role of standards and regulation in the economy. Standards are essential. They are not adversarial to the market system. They are required for a market system. They distinguish between progressive and regressive branches of the same business and favor the former at the expense of the latter. The absence of standards causes a backward movement in technology, in the environment, and every other social function that business ought to be respecting, and puts in charge the most regressive elements of the business sector. That should be unacceptable. It is clear that where standards are effectively applied, and it can be done, This is a part of the secret of the Scandinavian success. You end up with a technologically more advanced and more stable economy than you would have otherwise. And the third area that we need to think about and that distinguish what I have to say from a simple effort to recreate the New Deal is that we have to think about the position that the United States holds in the world. That position is very different from what it was in 1933, when we did not have, we had retreated from the military role we played in World War I, and we had not yet built up the post-war order that came in 1945. What we have now is a world to which for a couple of generations we have provided the security infrastructure. And in return, we have been granted the privilege of issuing the reserve currency, particularly since the early 1980s when the dollar was revalued enormously in the Volcker period. That is a privilege. It is something which has greatly aided our living standards, but it's a privilege that has to be earned. And with the end of the Cold War, the question for it is very much up in the air, not for any fault of our own, but because the fundamental division of the world changed. And over the years since, we have not done a very good job of persuading the rest of the world, to put it mildly, that we are worthy, either in terms of our external policy or our internal financial governance, of being the most trustworthy actor on the world stage. The system is being held together now mainly by inertia, mainly by the fact that it's very costly to change, and by the fact, which is infinitely to our advantage, that Europe has even greater problems, even worse governance, even less capacity to deal with this crisis than we do, as we will be discovering in the days immediately ahead. The European crisis is very severe and it's very hard to see how the institutions they have are going to be capable of coping with it. So the U.S. does have still some advantages, and I would argue that an extreme advantage that we have is that we have the institutional capacity to remake the world in the way that no other country does. We have the technical skills. We have the universities, the research centers. We have the flexibility in our governmental institutions if we choose to use them. And if we choose to use them for the purposes I've suggested, first of all, stabilizing our domestic economy, making our financial system stable and trustworthy, and beginning to solve some of the problems that we share not only with the world in the area of energy and climate change, I don't have any doubt that we could persuade the rest of the world to finance us. I don't think they have, first of all, much choice. But secondly, I mean, Uncle Sam is still the safe harbor in a world financial storm. We're discovering that the dollar hasn't collapsed. There was some worry about that. There's some worry about it in my book. But as the situation evolves, it becomes clear that other people are more fragile than we are. And that, again, is an opportunity. It's a crisis, but it's an opportunity and a responsibility, and we should rise to it. Thank you.
Excuse me. My name is Barry Lynn, as Reed said. Anyway, just wanted to say, Jamie, that your book annoyed me. It annoyed me because it was too good, because it was too well written, it was too powerful, it was too intricately argued, it was too full of insights, and it was too hard to put down. And as Reed mentioned, I'm writing a book myself, and I really don't have time to read other people's books. There's a note at the end of your book in which you mentioned one of your last meetings with your father, maybe it was the last meeting, in which he told you that if you wrote a book on corporate predation, that would make you the leading economic voice of this generation. That's not a modest claim. I actually think that, that you have achieved that. And the reason I think this is an important book, having actually read it, unlike what most people do with books in this town, is it's not merely because it's prescient. I mean, if you read through it, you see all of these, this book was closed maybe 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and you see all of these comments that reveal exactly, throw light on what's going on today. It's present. You see the presence right in the title. I mean, we have a corporatist moment here. We have a case in which a class of people is using institutions to seize power and to tax the system, tax us, and put the money into their own pockets. This book is important also because it recognizes the destructive nature of our financial system. One of my favorite little points in the book was the way you connect China's strength, China's resiliency, to the fact that their financial system is underdeveloped. And I think that's one of the most important points that I found in the book. The book is also important because Jamie declares, with no hedging whatsoever, that there is no such thing as a free market. The free market is a myth. There are markets, but markets are made. Markets are structured. Markets are structured through political acts. There is no such thing as a free market. It is a myth, and it is a myth that is designed precisely to hide the exercise of power. And I guess that's sort of what makes this book most important, is the fact that this is maybe the first real, true political economy that we've seen, work of political economy that we've seen in 2 generations since the new industrial state. And, you know, that's a book, I actually wrote a lot about that book in my book. I was, so it's something I looked at very carefully. And Jamie, a couple years ago, when there was a new edition of the New Industrial State, said that what was necessary was for all of us to kind of reconnect with the economics of that book. This is the book that was written by his own father in 1967. This was a form of economics that was essentially suppressed in this country beginning in the 1970s. My main critique of your book is that it's maybe too optimistic. Too optimistic, yeah. It's, you know, Jamie implies at various points that the corporatists, these actors who are using these governance institutions, who are wielding these governance institutions, the state power to loot the system, that at a certain point they're going to use these powers in a somewhat reasonable way. I mean, he has his doubts. He writes a lot about Katrina and the fact that Katrina seemed to reveal the fact that we were losing our ability to affect the real world. But I actually fear that it's what's going on is actually much worse. You know, I spent much of the last 20 years studying industrial systems, production systems. And everywhere I look in the real world, I see ideology deranging our ability to arrange actual physical systems in the world. You know, in the case of the industrial system itself, it's not merely that we have shifted power from workers to shareholders. We have shifted power away from engineers, the people who actually know how to make things work. And as a result, many of our basic production systems are on the edge. They're extremely fragile. We see this with the financial system. You know, the financial system is an engineered system. I mean, when we talk about the financial system, we should be talking about crumple zones. We should be talking about compartmentalization. We should be using hydraulic metaphors. You know, instead we use nonsense words. We use words like socialism. We live in a society. Hence, most of what we see around us is socialism. You know, we use words like regulation or deregulation. You know, that's another nonsense word. Every system is regulated. It's either regulated by us or it's regulated by private actors. I guess for me, the most concerning is the effects of this ideology on the international system. This also is an engineered system. The Bretton Woods system and the system since then were designed to engineer power in ways that yield peace and prosperity. This has worked very well for 65 years. This is a system that right now is also being deranged. You know, in the Soviet Union, the merger of power, politics, and science led to the outlawing of entire fields of science, such as the study of modern genetics. Free market fundamentalism is America's version of Lysenkoism. We have all but outlawed the use of common sense to run systems that we need to live. Anyway, that's why this book is so important. Because what we must do now is return to an economics of what is, an economics based on fact, an economics that is not based on a theory that is derived from a theory that is derived from a theory. So anyway, I wanted to thank you, Jamie, for starting the process.
Now top that.
Yeah, well, I'm just a little worried that maybe I was invited to present the con view. I don't think I'm gonna do a good job of that. Well, it's fun to be back at New America, and also great to be on a panel that consists entirely of American Prospect contributors. I'll be always happy to see that. I guess I'd like to say a few words about this wonderful and beautifully written book, in a way to situate it a little bit in the context of a kind of ongoing discussion about, you know, what was that last 8 or last 30 years all about, and you know, kind of the first few drafts of history that we're beginning to undertake, and I think I think this is very much the best of them. You could sort of divide them up. There isn't a view, especially of the last 8 years, that says, oh, this was, you know, the greatest period in American history, the greatest set of ideas and implementation, certainly. There are kind of two factions. There's one, the sort of noble dream view of it. People like Bruce Bartlett in his book Imposter, and Jamie has cited him, and he's brought the book, which sort of says, you know, there were these beautiful conservative ideals, and they just got betrayed by these slime balls. And then there's the kind of, it was all a scam viewpoint. Books like Tom Frank's The Wrecking Crew, or Naomi Klein's book Shock Doctrine, that basically say, you know, there was nothing ever, it was all basically a scam of self-aggrandizement all along modern economic conservatism, and, you know, Katrina is entirely of a piece with tax cuts, and it all fits together. And I find with books like that they sort of leave me saying, wasn't there a little more to conservatism than that? Michael Walzer wrote an essay after September 11th called "Can There Be a Decent Left?" and sort of those books always make me ask, well, could there have been a decent right? I mean, there had to have been something there. And I think what's distinctive about Jamie's book is that it begins, as he put it, with in a spirit of respect for the ideas, and it begins with ideas rather than beginning with political actors, and as a result, it kind of maps you through how each of those ideas kind of fell by the wayside when it actually didn't work. So it wasn't just like Tom DeLay put his self-interest ahead of the ideals. It was actually that as each of the ideas failed to work, it was kind of abandoned in certain ways, but the underlying ideology was not, and in many ways it was not. It was still respected as much by liberals, who kind of felt this was still out there as a force that they had to reckon with, even long after ideas like the free market or monetarism had really been reduced to serving purely short-term and instrumental goals. And I think the reason, I mean, there are a lot of reasons that I think Jamie's book gets this history right in ways that others don't, and the acuity of his analysis and the brilliance of his writing. But in many ways, it really is starting with economics and ideas and moving to politics rather than starting with politics. And I think that's a very important, as somebody who knows more about politics than I do about economics, I respect that approach, because I think it sort of gets you to the right place. And what's interesting is it gets you to sort of the big economic verities, I think, that pull you back. The idea of full employment, an idea you don't hear a lot. You see in Jamie that sense of what's an economy for? What's an economy supposed to achieve? It's not just supposed to be as efficient as possible. It's supposed to achieve human goods, and full employment as a centerpiece of those. Corporate responsibility and stewardship, and thinking about the long term, are all ideas that are embodied in this approach to economics and politics that are, we sort of have to draw out of. You don't find that too often in modern sort of political economy, and are profoundly important. I think it's very interesting. Having spent several years at New America, it's very interesting to me that this project grows out of that this discussion grows out of both our social contract project and our economic growth program. A few years ago, I felt like our project on the social contract, which I was a part of along with Reed, was a very traditional approach to saying, there's this, what government's role is to build a safety net. People do their stuff, and we build a little safety net underneath it. And if private sector can't provide health care, we'll build that safety net, and we'll fix unemployment insurance, and we'll do those, and we'll do those things. And I think one of the and that's embodied actually in the paper that's in your packet, and that's been a little bit of a premise. I think one of the big challenges to anybody thinking about the economic and political future of this country is that at the moment that's plainly not enough, and you really need to get back to an understanding that we can change what we want to change in the economy. We have to be willing to do it. There's not the liberal idea is you kind of build that safety net and let the free market go, and the conservative ideas don't even do that, because that would require taxes, and we can't do that. You need a little more of a willingness to actually grapple with the basic moving parts of the economy and have government do that. I think the last week has gotten me thinking about something, and I'll just kind of wrap up on this point. I think it's very important. I think there are three claims that are made for. Well, obviously, I agree with Barry, and I agree with Jamie that the free market is in many ways a myth. It's a myth that rested on three claims about what a market that's as unregulated as possible would achieve. The first was the claim of liberty. Obviously, it's essential freedom. You should be able to keep what you earn. A lot of essentially nonsensical claims, which I think are we have no more liberty in this economy than we would in one that had a larger role for government. The second claim is efficiency. And that the decisions of millions of market actors produce something far more efficient than anything that could be done with a larger role for government. And I think, in many ways, Barry's work has been very important about just how much capacity is stripped out in this quest for efficiency, and how much value there actually is in having a little bit of resilience in the system. And that's touched on in Jamie's book as well. The part that's always been compelling, most interesting to me about free market ideology is it really comes in large part from Hayek, which is it's just a better way of aggregating knowledge. Markets are nothing is smarter than price signaling mechanisms to aggregate knowledge about what things are worth. And so forth. And it's kind of hard to argue with that. It's kind of hard to argue with Hayek's concept of the catalaxy as the way of achieving better knowledge. If you want to argue with it, you got to stop using Google and go to the Encyclopedia Britannica instead. If you want to argue with that basic underlying concept. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is that there are profound limits to that, and that we have a financial sector that sort of got itself into a frenzy where its own ability to know what it's doing and how to value things is completely in question across all levels of the system. So that government steps in at this point, not because it can be smarter about how to allocate those resources, but just because only government has the capacity to actually handle the enormous risk that's been created in that private sector accumulation of price signaling about other prices and about abstract things that nobody can actually ever really get a handle on. So that I think it's a critical point in in the history of the relationship between government and the economy in the U.S., where all of a sudden, by accident, we will have a much larger, dramatic government role in the economy, but it's not done because we've changed our ideology and we think the government's actually going to be smarter about how to manage these resources, but simply because it's not going to be dumber. And it has the resilience that that nobody else in the sector has, and that's something that we will, I think, spend much of the next political era kind of coming to terms with, and then how do we actually make that work, and hopefully we do that with the kind of goals that Jamie talks about and few others talk about, front and center, goals like full employment and long-term stewardship of our both human and natural resources. So I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation, and it's a wonderful book which you all should read. Thank you.
We're going to let Jamie respond, and then we'll take some questions.
I'm frankly at a loss for a response. No author was ever so kindly treated by his discussants than I have just been treated. I do want to say thank you to both of them, and to Reed and the New America Foundation for doing this. And I think it would be appropriate now just to open it up for questions and discussion.
Let me start with one myself. Your book was reviewed in the New York Times book review by Roger Lowenstein, who it was a critical but admiring review. And he focused not on your argument that the free market has died, but really for your call on what we need is renewed state, government planning. You have a chapter called Planning, which, having received a master's in city planning at one point, I actually really appreciated. But he calls it, state planning, long discredited. And I guess I want to ask you, where do we find this capacity in government? And where it's not there, how fast can we ramp it up to deal with some of the challenges that you outlined?
I think where you have urgent needs, you can move very quickly. Some of the authority is already there. In dealing with the financial crisis, for example, the FDIC largely has the authority and the personnel to do what is required. In dealing with the energy problem, the other end of the spectrum, I think you need to proceed methodically. And I would begin with you need to build up your research capacity. You need to build up and organize universities and research centers and national labs around the problems that we actually face. You need to have authoritative presence in the cabinet dealing with this issue. In other words, ultimately you need to have a department that's focused on this. You need to figure out where in the government are the pressure points. If you want to have a capital expenditure budget that is going to move forward, you need to revamp your budgeting procedures so that it is not constantly being knocked out by pay-go provisions and things of this nature. You need to understand how the accounting works and what the objectives are in order to do that. But it's obvious that if you're rebuilding the country for long-term purposes, you don't do that out of current tax revenue. The appropriate thing to do is to fund it on a way that's matched to the maturity of the project, which is 30 or 40 years. And so all of these things have to be thought through and presented and have to become part of the discourse in a way which makes them persuasive to the public and to the political structure, and that takes some time.
Okay. Chris, you can say your name and where you're from and have a brief comment or question.
Yeah, I'm Chris Hayes, fellow New America, Washington Nation. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about investment, because I think that's one of the undercovered stories of the last few years. It's the fact that the whole point of our financial sector is to essentially efficiently divert the accumulated savings of savers to productive investment, and yet there's been tremendous underinvestment in the business sector, both during this expansion and before that. And I'm just curious what you think accounts for this kind of investment paradox.
Well, in a long-run sense, a major force behind the decline in corporate investment as a share of the total, I think, is the tax code and the way in which corporations were restructured to become instruments of short-term financial profit and executive compensation. In the financial sector, what fraction of the gross revenue of the late and unlimited investment banking houses, it was actually paid out as executive compensation. It's, by all odds, very high. Why is that? Because one consequence of the reduction in marginal tax rates was to make it attractive for corporations to move corporate executives to move funds from the corporate accounts to the private accounts. Previously, it was taxed for very high income people at punitive rates. And as a result, they left the money in the businesses accumulated earnings, and what did they do? They built skyscrapers with them. So the city of New York, Manhattan, has a particular architectural profile because of a particular moment in the tax structure, and that was true, and that's true for the other great industrial cities of the country. And so, I mean, what do we get what do we get in physical investment out of the new tax structure? McMansions, spread out over every hillside in the Southwest. You can go see them, but they don't have the same lasting, productive implications.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I run something called the Energy Conversation, and if you look us up on the internet, our next session is on the 20th of October at the DoubleTree Hotel. I'm struck by how we are a nation that is trained to think of one-off solutions. Lawyers are taught, here's my problem, how do I get my client out of the difficulties in? And we don't think in terms of second, third, fourth, fifth consequences of the choices we make. And what I would be really interested in is to see a graph of how all these things are connected. So as people who are on different parts of it understand how their roles are and how they play into this. I mean, you just brought up the tax code, which I guess I hadn't heard in your talk. But each one of these things has an implication. And all of this, I think, needs to be exposed so the rest of us can understand it. And if we're dependent upon reading large books, most people don't have time to read large books. So I would ask you at some time to give us a graphic so we can at least understand how everything's connected to everything else.
Well, I'll say two things in my defense. First of all, it's not a very large book. But secondly, my editor said to me very firmly, no graphs, no equations, no tables.
I didn't ask you that.
No, but equation is a mathematician's graph. It's just another way of expressing the same thought. But the idea here was to write a book that was actually written in orderly English, without the crutches that I used in my previous books to cover up my insecurities about capacity to convey thought in orderly English. Man, it was difficult. I sent in 100,000 words. He cut 40,000 words out of it. I accepted every single one of those cuts and then went back and redid the manuscript. This was the hardest thing I've ever done.
I'm Bob Feinberg, a former colleague of Jamie, and I'm not going to ask for equal time. Now, you would give it to him. I appreciate and I have a question at the end of this.
Louder, please.
I appreciate the respect that Jamie gave to the conservative movement. Unfortunately, the conservative movement ended the day after Ronald Reagan took office, when the Bush people hijacked him. And your story about Charlie Rand, and liberals contributed to this too. The Fannie Mae myth was largely almost entirely a liberal creation. Your mention of Charlie Rangel reminds me of his remark that the Bush administration proves for all time the fallacy of the myth of white supremacy. The specific question that goes to your points about the current situation is you've said that hedge fund, because the question is how much of this infrastructure that was built by crony capitalism should be preserved and allowed to continue to do its work. You mentioned that hedge funds should be left behind because of the nature of the people behind them. My question is, haven't the too big to fail banks in effect become federally insured hedge funds? And could you conceive of a way to get in there and separate the hedge fund part from essentially the commodity business that perhaps could go forward and meet its fate at another part of the cycle?
Okay, first of all, I can't resist a comment going back even further than our acquaintance goes back probably 35 years, which is that I went to high school at Andover at roughly the same period as the Bush brothers, and I escaped by spending a junior year in France. Went back for a 35-year reunion and told the students who were there now that I was a failure, because I had left Andover 35 years previously to get away from people like the Bush brothers, and 35 years later I hadn't succeeded. The question that you raise about which is really a question about the commingling of disparate functions in the banking system. And in some ways it can be thought of as a question about whether we should have Glass-Steagall reinstated. In other words, to separate out the speculative and investment banking functions from the commercial banking functions. And whether that is something that is viable right now is a very interesting question. And I think that we got to a system in which the investment banking functions have largely imploded. And in which we are moving for safety's sake to large universal banks. To me, the essential steps that are going to have to be taken to restore the credibility and viability of the banking system are, first of all, you do need to get the element of fear and panic out of the situation. That's almost entirely unproductive because it obscures the underlying solvency question. Some banks are solvent, some are not. Secondly, you need to evaluate those that are in danger, which could be helped by an infusion of public capital. Those that are insolvent, and of the latter two groups, those that are insolvent because of economic conditions, or those that are insolvent because they're basically hopelessly mismanaged or even corrupt institutions. The final group you have to close, because if you leave them open, they will simply run up losses. That was the lesson of the savings and loan. Traditional savings and loans that were insolvent for economic reasons, but not for reasons of corruption, could be kept open under supervision until economic conditions improved, and many of them remained viable after the end of the 1980s. Something like that would probably be true of the banking system now. Again, you have a triage problem that has to be dealt with in a framework of much stricter regulation, including regulation that affects the growth of the institutions to prevent them from playing destructive games once they're under the public umbrella in the way which they're going to fall under it.
Dr. Galbraith, I'm Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report, and I want to come back to this notion of planning. A couple of weeks ago, the New American Foundation did a session on the financial and fiscal crisis, and a piece of it was about essentially the need for planning or change management capacity in government. And as someone who, in an earlier part of my life, before writing about politics, I ran organizations in the private sector and elsewhere, and was a strong believer in and saw the direct results of organizations that did planning and those that didn't. And perhaps the first component of the success of the planning process is that the term that we often use was the owners of the enterprise have to be involved in the planning process. The concern I had in the discussion that took place in New America a couple of weeks ago was that it was based on the assumption that the planning process takes place in the executive branch. And my question is, do you talk about it in the book, or have you thought about how you design a planning process that also incorporates the legislative piece? In other words, Articles 1 and Articles 2 doing this together.
The answer to that is yes, I have thought about this. I was part for many years of just such a process, which was the dialogue that was set up in the Employment Act of 1945 between the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Committee. I spent 4 years as the Democratic Staff Director, Executive Director of the Joint Economic Committee. And that was in many ways a model for a process that involved interaction. And I don't think you can plan without dialogue and without checks and balances in the process. Members of Congress who were appointed to the Joint Economic Committee took their responsibilities, I think, quite seriously, in the sense that they took their partisan and not their partisan hats, but they took their legislative hats off and put on a hat, when they came over to the committee, of thinking about the larger issues of the economy and responding to what the President and the Council of Economic Advisors said in a serious way. And that's a hard trick to duplicate, but it seems to me to be essentially part of the process. That's an essential part of the process. I think that the Congressional Budget Office represents a different model, and one which, while it has important functions with respect to the way legislation is drafted, is much less effective at bringing members of Congress directly into the discussion. In other words, it gives them a report on what they're doing, and a report under certain assumptions, which are quite problematic in many ways. But it is not something which brings them into discussion on the policy questions in a serious way.
Justine Kilpatrick, retired. I have two big questions, but I'll ask you one. Thinking about the financial restructuring and the regulation that should follow on, and what you foresee in the longer term as an opportunity, given you have something broken here and you fix it. I have the impression that we have too large a financial services sector relative to the underlying economy, and that it's too leveraged and so forth. How would you talk about the principles we should follow in stabilizing the part that's most useful, and what of the other parts might be useful or not?
I think you're right. The financial services sector is far too large. I was on a debate with Kenneth Rogoff, the former chief economist for the IMF, and he made this point. 10% of wages and 30% of profits run through this sector. That is vastly more than we need. A friend of mine signs all of his emails underneath his signature with the phrase, "The financial sector is more trouble than it's worth." And there's a lot to that. What should be done? Well, I think the essential points are, first of all, once you move to, in effect, insuring deposits, you are basically saying that we are not going to try to, we're not going to rely on competition for deposits as a mechanism for stabilizing the financial sector. We've tried that. It doesn't work very well, and it's subject to, once the insurance limits become too low, it's subject to instability and panic, which is what we're seeing. We can't afford that. So we're going to have to regulate it on the asset side. In other words, we have to have supervision of what banks and other financial institutions actually do. And, the idea Elizabeth Warren had of a financial product safety commission strikes me as a very sensible thought, and sensible way to proceed to ensure, and maybe not enough in the current circumstances, but to ensure that there is that we don't get this kind of anything goes atmosphere in the creation of financial products. Another principle that seems to me to be very well taken that Paul Davidson has articulated concerns what should and should not be securitized. I think, Bob and I have a difference on this, I'm sure, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac performed a very important function. For many years, they provided the securitization of prime mortgages that permitted the great growth in home ownership, and they did so in a reasonably stable way. There are many abuses, particularly in recent years, in the way those corporations were run. I don't think they should have been privatized in the first place, a decision that goes back to the Johnson administration. But they nevertheless were very useful enterprises. The problems in housing arise in the subprime and Alt-A segments, which are not Fannie and Freddie. That's where Countrywide is the originator and so on. So the regulators have to be in on that process in a serious way. In effect, Davidson's point is that those kinds of assets, which are essentially a non-commodity mortgage, cannot be securitized effectively. If you're going to do anything of that kind, it has to be on a originate and hold model. So fundamentally, the regulators have to be in on this. There have to be certain prudential principles that have to be applied fairly rigorously. In many ways, the way the banking system needs to be reconstructed at this point, if you're going to guarantee deposits, you've got essentially a regulated utility. And it's not a natural monopoly. It needs to be, competition can play some role in the way the institutions are run, but like all regulated utilities, you need to have a very, very clear regulatory governance, or it will explode on you.
I'm Kathy Nelson, retired from HUD, where my job for 20 years or so was documenting how much housing was becoming unaffordable, particularly for extremely low-income renters and homeowners. And I'd like to raise a question, sort of taking off from your concern, correct concern, I think, with stabilizing the economy and protecting innocent bystanders. And that is, in all of the current crisis, there seems to be very, very little attention to the renters. There's correct concern for low-income homeowners and what will be done for them, but at the same time that so many people are thrust into from being owners to renters, and there's this general, freeze up of the credit system. I'm really concerned that homes may be lost, entire neighborhoods devastated, and the lowest income renters that are the most already in the worst position get added problems as higher income former homeowners have come into the rental market. And so my question is basically, what would you do? Do you think that's a valid concern?
I think it's a very plausible scenario. I think that in essence what you want to prevent is having a large number of vacant homes on the market. I mean, in the Depression, people lived in HOLC homes at reasonable rents until they didn't live in them indefinitely. The government eventually sold them, but there was a duty to maintain and so on. And the housing stock was not allowed to deteriorate. The problem with an abandoned house is that it becomes unlivable pretty quickly. Someone goes in and rips out the plumbing and the wiring, and you might as well raise the thing. That problem has to be addressed. That's really becoming an increasingly urgent concern. If you keep the housing stock in motion, then of course you won't have any fewer houses as a result of this. It's just a question of getting people into them on affordable terms.
Merrill Dusner with the Center for Science and the Public Interest. Jamie, I look forward to reading your book. I want to focus on the second of your points, which is about regulation and about the capacity of institutions, specifically the regulatory agencies. Like any homeowner, dial back a couple of years, I was getting dozens of offers, boiler rooms calling me up, offering me loans. And there was no policing of this going on anywhere in our society. And yet we have regulatory agencies that were supposed to be policing it, not only here in Washington, but basically in every state in the country where you have consumer protection, and apparently nothing was done. And I think, just based on private conversations that I've had in recent months with people who work at the Fed, for instance, many years ago, I had another career where I used to cover people who worked at the Fed, and when you talk to them, they remind you about how much they've been captured themselves by the kind of free market ideology you've been talking about, and sort of no longer have the capacity to regulate. I've been paying close attention to this in the healthcare sphere, but we have a real problem in our regulatory sector, so I don't know if you've addressed it in your book, but I'd like to hear you say, what do we need to do to rebuild regulatory capacity? And then the second one has to do with the institutions that sort of monitor the whole process. Again, I come at this from having been a financial reporter for many years of my life, and there was a front page story in the New York Times last week that talked about an obscure regulation being lifted back in 2004 that basically unhinged investment banks from any kind of capital requirements at all, and as a result allowed a lot of things to pyramid out of control, and there was no coverage of it at the time. And I'm reminded of the statement Maureen Dowd had made when she came to this city as a reporter and said, I'm not going to be caught covering any agencies that have letters attached to their name, and that's sort of how she started. So my question becomes,
She's maintained that pledge.
yeah, exactly. But she was a reporter when she first got here, not a columnist. So my question sort of becomes, in that front, in writing your book, did you find the financial press or the press very useful in tracing the history of what's going wrong in this decade? And if not, what do you think needs to be done in that regard in terms of not just the regulatory agencies themselves, but the monitoring of regulatory agencies in order to have citizen capacity to do that?
I don't have a stock answer to the second question. I think it probably could be done in a number of ways that would be. I think we have media which are sufficiently specialized or sufficiently capable of specialization. One could effectively put people on the beat in a way that the institutions that employ the Maureen Dowds of the world are not likely to do. Bob and I both know from our time in the congressional staff that we used to rely on lots of little newsletters that were not big circulation, but which gave you insight onto regulatory matters that was extremely valuable. Certainly, electronic media permits that in principle to be done on an extensive scale. On your first question, what needs to be done? I mean, first of all, it's a question of philosophy. It's a question of understanding what the purpose of regulation is and why it is indispensable. That is something which, the American voters are going to decide in 30 days whether they want to take a chance on a change of philosophy or not. They have a ticket in front of them, which until last week was a committed deregulation ticket. The head of the ticket said, I'm a deregulator. With the candidate for vice president, one comment on her economic philosophy said, government, get out of our hair. Where at their convention, former presidential candidate in a speech that was surely vetted said he was going to, that party would take a weed whacker to government regulations. That's the philosophy. It's been clearly stated. It is clearly part and parcel of the record. The chief economic advisor in that campaign was the architect of the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the architect of the Enron loophole, the architect of the credit default swaps loophole, and much else besides. So it's not as though there isn't, this point of view is represented in national politics at the highest level, and if that party is elected, there will be a fundamental problem of trust. They cannot turn around and say, we are going to re-regulate the system and expect any reasonable person with money on the line to believe a single solitary word of it. Not going to happen. So almost anything that is attempted would be subject to a fatal lack of credibility, fundamentally, even if they were serious. I don't believe for a minute that they would be serious, but even if they were, they couldn't persuade any reasonable person of it because the record is too long and too clear. On the other side, persuading the world and the country that things have to change is not going to be easy, but it seems to me at least feasible. It's something that can be done if there's a serious effort to do it. Second piece is personnel. You have to bring people in. You have to restaff agencies with calm, reasonable, well-trained people with ethical standards and not zealots I don't think you want to launch the career of a battalion of Rudy Giulianis in this. You want to have people who are determined to do this on the long haul and willing to do it for the long haul in a serious way, and according to the standards that you lay out for them. So that's the second piece of it. The third piece of it is something I couldn't summarize for you, but there will surely be need for new legislative authority in various areas, and that's going to be the problem that Barney Frank is going to face in the next Congress, and he knows he's going to face it. He said so.
Hi, I'm Josiah Ryan. I cover the Senate for CNS News. I wanted to ask you about your title. I think a lot of congressional conservatives would object to the suggestion that they had abandoned the free market. And we saw kind of a brief rebellion among them some of them last Monday when they voted against it. They obviously didn't last long. But even in the Senate, senators who voted for it were conservatives, said the way we got where we are is because we have, in a way, abandoned the free market. And the only way to get back to the free market is by having this bailout and moving back to where we were. And I'm wondering if you see in the future, in politics anyway, is this idea of the free market is going to continue and be and live another day, or have conservatives really abandoned it? And are we going to see even the fight for it disappear?
Well, I think that the elements of true belief and honest belief will never entirely disappear, and certainly not from the Congress. I mean, I've known Congressman Paul since I worked on the Hill and on the banking committee, for that matter, in the middle 1970s, and I believe he's an honest man. Takes his beliefs seriously, holds them seriously. But there is a conflict between that body of ideas and the reality of a complex state and society in which we live, which means that when that body of ideas makes even a toehold in the policy process, it just doesn't last very long. It gets blown off course, and you can see this repeatedly in the way in which the Federal Reserve rethinks what it thinks about or claims to think about monetary policy. There's a little history of this in my book, how these ideas have morphed in the face of crises and adverse evidence over 30 years, and one can go on through each of these cases. I mean, we had a pretty good example of the conservative philosophy in action in the first Reagan tax cuts, and by 1982 and 84 and 86, pressure of events was requiring those things to be taken back to a very substantial extent. So you ended up going in an entirely different direction in the 86 tax reform. So that's, I think someone who's in the legislative branch and who doesn't have operational responsibility has a lot of freedom to be a philosopher. And that's true, I think, on all sides of the spectrum. When you're actually trying to govern, these principles run up against reality. People who harbor them seriously find themselves being disillusioned quite quickly and end up as critics on the outside. And that's where I think they will be for the foreseeable future.
Okay, we're going to take 3 comments, questions in order, and let Jamie respond. 1, 2, back.
Okay, I don't have a comment. I just have a question. I was listening to what you were saying, and you were saying that something about banks not competing for deposits. And one thing I had a question was, how would that fit into like a mercantile society where countries are competing for those same dollars? How would that work to prevent capital flight, thereby debasing your ability to fund your projects?
Well, okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Let's get them all in so you can find there. Yeah, in the back.
My question is about the relationship between progressives and federal government. So, like, over the last 8 years, it seems to me that progressives have been advocating, especially energy and environmental goals on a state level and a municipal level. So, part of this is just because Bush was in power, right? But then there seems to be another part of it too, which is this progressive ideal of community and kind of just decentralized action being a major part of liberal people and the way they think about achieving political goals. Now, going forward, goals with energy and the environment, infrastructure, carbon treaties, if those come about, these are things that kind of demand a federal level of action. Now, I'm wondering now. I don't know who's going to be in power, obviously, in the fall, but you think, maybe assuming Obama gets in, are progressives going to be able to start thinking in federal terms, really going to kind of Washington and realizing that that's the place to take things on from?
This is the real challenge for to answer all three at once. I think that'll be fun.
And mine is completely different. What is the problem in Europe? Since they've done some of the things that we think are right, they have a serious social net, they have a serious, they pay taxes. They had a housing bubble, but other than that, why are they in trouble? Is it because they bought our stuff?
Okay, actually, the first and the third question are very closely related, because we see the problem of European governance emerged a few days ago in very clear form when the Irish government moved to guarantee all deposits. Well, now what happens? You get a run on the German banks as people move their money to Ireland because they want a place where it's safe. And so the German government will be forced, if it hasn't already taken that step today, to follow suit. And then, of course, the cascade will occur elsewhere. This is crazy. There should be one European authority capable of stabilizing the European financial system, and there isn't. And that is going to it's causing people whose opinion I respect to doubt whether the euro will survive to the end of the year. Now, I suspect that it probably will, but I'm saying that this issue should not be even close to being raised at this stage, and yet it's clear that the governance structures are so weak at the European level that they vitiate the social protections that existed at the national level in many, many cases. And so, I mean, the situation in many places in Europe, France I know is a case I know particularly well, is really quite desperate. And in spite of the fact that very much stronger welfare states were built there over much of the post-war period. And I think that gets to your question, that obviously there is a competitive element in this, and the last thing you want is a run on dollar assets to go into other safe havens. The great advantage the United States has, this is a big country with a single government, and so we are still a safe haven. Nobody's going to put their money in RMB, and it turns out people are not particularly happy about the euro right now. It's overpriced and understabilized. The final question then has just to turn to the question. The answer to your question is yes. It is obviously a sensible adjustment to the political circumstances that we've been in to work at the community and the state and local level and try to get things done there to develop ideas. But at some point, it's necessary to bring the national government back into the game in an extremely serious way, and we are arriving at that point very, very fast, in my view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie.